let me introduce our esteemed panel. This evening, taking center stage is Cathy Van Zyl, Master of Wine. For those of you who don't know, Cathy is the Associate Editor of Plater's Wine Guide to South Africa, and in her various other roles, she has intimate knowledge of the South African wine industry. The winemakers, Hannes Storm, that is he has vineyards in all three wards of Hemel-en-Aarde, and Richard Kershaw, Master of Wine, that will for tonight represent Elgin, is our Elgin specialist. And so, Cathy, do you want to? I spoke enough. Do you want to present our winemakers, please?
Great. Hello, everybody. It's super to see you all. It's great to see some faces on the screen that I haven't seen for such a long time. And Moshe, you say I'm going to be taking center stage. That is not going to happen. We're going to be listening to words of wisdom from Hannes Storm, owner of Storm Wines, and also to Richard Kershaw, owner of Richard Kershaw Wines. And as you can see, he's color coordinated with his stripe, his swipe of his label over there. For a second, Richard, I thought that you and Hannes had up the same vineyard photograph, and then you quickly moved it away. But anyway, what we hope to achieve this evening is give you all an introduction to South Africa, the Pinot Noirs of the Hemel-en-Aarde and also Elgin. And we're going to, I know that a lot of you here actually make wine in the region, not a lot, one or two, but it really is an opportunity for you to learn about the complexities of these two wine growing regions and find out what are their similarities and what are their differences. So please do ask questions. I know that there's a couple of WSET students on board, and Moshe has already prepared a few WSET type questions to ask. I know that there's some Cape Wine Academy people also on board, so please ask your questions. Saturday I'm lecturing white wine, so you won't be able to pick up any tips or hear anything from me about white wine on Saturday, but I'm sure that's you, Joop. You coming again? No? Yes, okay. So without further ado, let's kick off quickly so that you can hear the stories from Richard and Hannes, because they're the ones who are the most interesting people on the screen this evening. So Pinot Noir, Moshe, if you can share our slide, please.
So hold on a sec. I think that's the one you're after. I don't know if everybody can see that.
Yes, I just have to move everybody out of the way of the slide there. That's great. Okay, so Pinot Noir in South Africa, just a few statistics to put it into perspective. We have roughly 92 hectares under vine in South Africa, which is down from 5 years ago when we were over 100,000 hectares under vine. And our split is still predominantly white varieties, 51,000 hectares under white varieties, 41 under red varieties. And of the total that is under vine, we have only 1.3% that is planted to Pinot Noir, amounting to a minuscule 1,200 and a very important 1 hectare of Pinot Noir. Just to put that into context, our 5 most planted grape varieties, I've put the percentages up for you on the screen. So 11% of our 92,000 hectares is to Cabernet, 10% to Shiraz, and you can read the rest. Pinotage, Merlot, and then something which I don't think is well known in other places around the world, Ruby Cab. You can see how quickly the percentages drop off there. Now, of the Pinot Noir that we have in the country, it's 317 hectares are from the Cape South Coast. Now, this is the region in which both the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley and Elgin are situated. It's also where the most Pinot Noir is to be found. And I'm going to translate for you. 280 hectares in Stellenbosch, 233 in Robertson, 169 in Paarl, 83 in what looks like Ireland, but it's actually Swartland, 38 in Breedekloof, 32 in the Orange River, 24 in Worcester, 21 in the Klein Karoo, and 5 hectares only in the Northern Cape. And then within the 2 regions that we're going to be visiting tonight, there's 106 hectares in Elgin and 144 in Walker Bay. Now, Walker Bay is the district into which the wards of the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley are situated. So that's put it into context. You can see it's a very, very small percentage of our grapes that are grown, but it is arguably one of the categories that does help grow our image overseas, because we have quite a number of very good producers. I have some Storm Freda in my glass. So
Sorry,
with that, yes?
Sorry, Cathy, if maybe, sorry to be an annoying and interject. I think it would be worthwhile also pointing out that there's a number of hectares, especially in Stellenbosch and outside, that are not actually producing red Pinot, they're producing it for sparkling wine as well. Thank
you, Richard. I was going to say that, but it slipped my mind because I was so ready to toast Hannes with his Freda. That's correct. Okay. Most of the Pinot plantings in Robertson, you saw they had a large percentage over there, and in Stellenbosch are used for sparkling wine production as opposed to red Pinot Noir. So, cheers to Hannes. Hannes, would you like to give us an introduction to the valley in which you make your wine, and perhaps also tell a little bit about the history of how Pinot came to be planted in the valley, and then move on to why there are 3 wards in the valley today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cathy. Yeah, and welcome everybody, and it's a privilege to tell you our story. So the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley, for me, it kicked off in 2000. So I did my 22nd vintage this year. A wonderful area, very narrow valley, very close to the ocean. So we started in 1975, as far as Pinot Noir is concerned, when the Hamilton Russells found a property in the Hemel-en-Aarde, and in 1976 planted that to the Burgundian cultivars and so forth, to make Pinot Noir. And I think what stands out in the Hemel-en-Aarde is just the close proximity to the cool Atlantic Ocean. As you can see on the map there, very close to the ocean. The Freda vineyard, what I'm having in a glass at the moment, is very, very close to the ocean, about 2.2 kilometers as a crow flies. So firstly, the maritime influence, and then secondly, the wonderful low vigor soils, clay-rich soils that we work with. Obviously, we will elaborate a bit more on the soils of the 3 different wards. But so the first wines produced here in 1981. So it's like a 42-year-old history, more or less, for Pinot Noir. And it is it's a wonderful journey. And I think so many things happened in the past 2 or 3 decades, with such a lot of new producers coming up in the valley, exploring the soils, and the knowledge of the soils are understood so much better, the intricacies of the soils. So in 2004, basically it was decided, because the Walkerway was a very big growing area, it was decided that there must be a smaller demarcation established in the area. So 2004, they started working on that, and then in 2006 August, the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley and the Upper Hemel-en-Aarde Valley wards came to fruition in the valley. So and then after that, in 2009, the Hemel-en-Aarde Ridge was born, and basically everything based on aspects, soils, and terroir and watershed in the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley. So what we are doing at Storm Wines is we are focusing on 3 different, 3 single vineyards in the different appellations, showcasing the different soils, the different aspects, and the terroirs of the 3 areas without any intervention from our side, just to basically steer them into the bottle, to express the terroirs under the cork. So that's more or less what we do at Storm Wines. I started my journey, as mentioned, in 2000 in Hemel-en-Aarde, worked at Hemel-en-Aarde vineyards for 13 years in the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley. And then in 2012, we had our maiden vintage of Storm. So it was planted in 2008, both of the Fred and the Ignis vineyard. And yeah, it is wonderful. It's wonderful to see the differences in the wines at the end, and then to compare them just from a soil point of view. So just the Ignis vineyard, the Fred vineyard, as mentioned, about 2.3 kilometers, 2.2 kilometers from the cool Atlantic Ocean, and that is characterized by Bockerveld shale-derived clay soils. So we have heavy clay soils, low vigor soils, and then close to the ocean. And when we move up to the Ignis vineyard, which is in the upper Hemel-en-Aarde Valley, there we are working with decomposed granite soils. That is a much lighter structured soil. Fred vineyard up to almost a 45% clay content, while the Ignis is almost half of that. So other difference there also, Fred is on about 125 meters above sea level, while Ignis is on about 220, so about 100 meters higher. So a bit cooler when you take into account the difference in altitude. Both are northern slopes, but very different soils. So the upper Hemel-en-Aarde is also the biggest of the three appellations. We have a bit more, we have different aspects, slopes that we work with, soil differences, as opposed to the Fred vineyard, which is in the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley, which are mostly on western and northwestern slopes. So a bit warmer, on 125 meters. And then when we move up to the ridge, which is then the highest appellation we work with, that is 200 meters higher than Fred. So that's on about 330 meters. And that's on the eastern slope. So it's also the smallest of the three appellations, but exactly the same soils as the Fred vineyard or the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley is Bockerveld shale-derived clay soils. So when you stand in the actual soil, it's very difficult to distinguish the two soils from if you look at the topsoil. You have these shale stones on the topsoil with heavy prismoctanic clay and the subsoils. The ridge, obviously, because it's higher, it's cooler. There are, for me, always three factors that make it quite a big difference. It's higher in elevation, thus it's cooler. It is on the eastern slope, so it only catches the direct morning sunlight, and then also it's more exposed to the cool southeasterly winds because it's higher. So that's mainly the three aspects I look at when we vinify the wines. Interestingly, the ripening of the three vineyards I don't want to say in normal years. I don't know what normal is anymore. But usually about 10 days between the three vineyards. So usually we'll kick off in the first week of February with the Fred vineyard, which is the warmest, and we'll end the end of February, beginning of March with the Ridge vineyard, and then the Ignis vineyard somewhere in between. So that's basically just in a nutshell what we work with. Yeah, fairly young area. Let's say it kicked off in 1975, 1976, but I think so many things happened in the past decade, 15 years to 10 years of new producers and finding the little small pockets of land in the Hemel-en-Aarde and really pushing the envelope as far as quality is concerned. Yeah.
And Hannes, I know you mentioned right in the beginning that you really just shepherd the grapes into the bottle. You've got a very non-interventionist approach. And if I remember correctly from tasting your wines for a number of years now, you usually use very much in terms of the same amount of whole bunch and some stems across the three wines as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Cathy, that all depends on the vintage, obviously, how cool and how warm it is, and what the yields are. But usually we are on a maximum of about 20% the whole bunch. We have done a bit more in 2020 vintage. We could handle that. But what we try and do is not to mask the terroir. And when we compare the wines and we go above that 25-30%, we start masking the terroirs when you compare the wines. And they get drawn together closer, and that's not really what we want to showcase in the wines. But it always adds a fantastic aspect to the wines, which I really love.
So you use the magic words. You don't want to mask the terroirs. So can you just unpack it for us and tell us exactly what Fred the Frieda terroir gives
Yeah.
to your wine, etc. with Ignis. Oh, and if I can just tell the people who are non-South African, Frieda, it means peace. So that's the Peace Vineyard. Ignis is named after the soil, correct?
Yeah,
or
so
the rock?
so Ignis is then the igneous rock, ignite, in the Latin word for fire, and that makes reference to the granite, decomposed
correct. Granite. And then ridge is just where it is. It's on the ridge, so it's just three differently named vineyards. Anyway, so let's move back. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, 100%.
What then are the characteristics that get shown then in the glass?
What we found is on the heavy clay soils. It also we'll elaborate a bit more on the clones also maybe later. Just on the clay soils, we find a lot of textural components. There's always structure in the clay, a little bit of that base note. So there's always, if you look at the soils and you see the soils, very low yielding soils. A year like this, we got a 1.6 tons per hectare scenario. But there's always in the Frieda, because of the heavy clay soils, always textural components and structure. What we find with the clone that we work with here is the 115 and 113. And the 115 clone on the clay soils in the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley appellation usually shows us a bit more of the floral perfumes. So we always have that violet rose petal characters, Turkish delight rose water characters, but with the underlying textural and structural component from the clay. So that's why that's for me always how I distinguish Frieda from the rest. It's more about the floral perfumes, and then also a wine that it takes a bit longer to develop. So it's one of those wines also that will benefit from maturation for quite some time. When we start opening the 12s and 13s at the moment, the maiden vintage 12, we can now see that it slowly start developing that secondary character, but it retains that freshness and the floral components on the nose, which is quite exciting for us to see. I think the main thing of the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley soils also is just the low yielding, the natural low yielding aspect of it, and good natural acidities that we work with. So we will never get more than 4 tons per hectare, which equates to probably about 25 hectoliters per hectare, which is in context very low. I think I worked out the 2019 vintage that we have here. We had a 1.45 tons per hectare scenario, and then if you express that into a hectoliter per hectare scenario, it's very minute. So, but I think that definitely, and then obviously the other thing that is characteristic of the Frieda is close to the ocean. So there's always a cool breeze bringing that cool southeasterly wind in and cooling it down in the ripening time. What we've also found when we look at the weather data in the Hemel-en-Aarde, we've also seen that the important months in the ripening time, December, January, February, March, we are on an average maximum temperature of about 25. That's about our average. So if you look at Burgundy at the same 4 months, we're very, very close by. I think they're like 25.3 or 25.5 on average. So we're very close to Burgundy in that time, and I think it's quite an important time in the ripening phase to at least have to preserve fruit, the development of the fruit that can happen in an orderly manner. So that's basically Frieda. And then if we move to Ignis, Ignis for us always, obviously, I mentioned the lighter structured soils. There, it's not so one-dimensionally the fruit perfumes, but there's a bit of other characters coming there. So it's definitely a lighter structured wine. The tannin structure not as substantial, and then a bit more of that spicy notes and wild strawberry characters, fynbos tea characters. So quite an interesting difference, very different wine when you compare it to the Frieda. As mentioned, a bit cooler, probably about 1 degree Celsius on average cooler because it's 100 meters higher in elevation. And then, harvesting time usually about 10 days later than Frieda.
Oh, you're on mute, Cathy.
Yeah. And Rich, Hannes?
Yeah, so when we move to the Ridge, that for me is always an interesting site because we always have this cool wind blowing there. So Ridge, as mentioned, also clay soils. You have that Bockerveld shale on the eastern slope, so it's much cooler. And I think with this cool climate, it brings a bit more of that spicy notes. we definitely have a lower pH, higher acidity to start with. There's always a bit of a more violet purple color to the wine. But one thing that it reminds me of is also the Santa Rita Hills wines, which we have that baking spice and Christmas cake baking spice characters. And that is something that sometimes stand out for me in the rich lead pencil shavings, graphite, and then that darker berry fruit, the black currant, with that baking spice character. So it's a bit more spicy. A wine that's sometimes a bit more austere, takes a bit longer to develop, but because of the low pH that we work with, higher acidities to start with. We try to harvest the wines. I kind of like to say it's a sweet spot for the alcohol wines and ripeness wines, but they're usually about 13.5% alcohol, all of them, where we found them to be not above 13.5. That's more or less what we aim for from a phenological side also, and that works out at that.
Hannes, before we move on to Richard, I just wanted to ask you two things quickly. You mentioned Santa Rita. That's where your brother is making wine. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Aaron's moved there in 2004, and he started working there in 2006. He has two vineyards that he works with in the 3 vineyards in the Santa Rita Hills area, and then 1 vineyard in the Santa Maria Valley. So it's all good to compare notes. Luckily, we have the same winemaking approach, so it's also less is more, and it's always good to see the differences between these wines and approach. And it's wonderful also to see that there are some correlations between the Santa Rita Hills area and the Hemel-en-Aarde. With the sea influence, we perhaps don't have that mist that rolls in from the cool Pacific Ocean, but we definitely have. There's a lot going for correlations between the two areas, I find.
Okay, we have a question now from Cassidy Havens. He wants to know, are your vines planted on rootstocks? And if so, do they vary between the 3 sites? And what attributes do you choose your rootstocks by? A really good question.
Yeah. So more or less, because we have very low vigorous soils, we tend to plant them all on more vigorous rootstocks. It depends a bit on the water buffering of the rootstocks, but mainly some of the rootstocks that are on the Frida property is actually planted to table grape varieties that you basically more or less use for that, just to get a bit more vigor out of the plant, out of the soil. But it varies, but usually it's like we probably have an 80% Richter 1:10 scenario going on in a Paulson rootstocks. But it depends basically on the soils a bit, but mostly we want more vigorous, just vigorous plants to get the most out of these poor soils that we work with.
Okay, thank you. The other question was, have you worked a harvest with your brother in Santa Rita?
Yeah, I've actually done a few times, but 2015 and 2016 I was there for the whole harvest. Yeah, so it was quite cool to work together. He was here also a few times already. So.
Yep, we'll come back to your question. It's also a very interesting question. I want to just get Richard to kick off and start talking. Richard, you make your Pinot Noir. You've got one from the Ridge and one from Elgin. Would you like to introduce us to Elgin and then explain the differences?
Yes, absolutely. What I can do is perhaps just start. I'll probably start with the Ridge because it follows on really from what Hannes is saying. Yes. Okay. So, sorry. Welcome. It's just a quick introduction. But before I start, obviously I'm based in Elgin and have been making my own wines since 2012. And I moved there for various reasons, which I'll explain in a moment. But I basically, I started with Pinot Noir a little later because I was really more Chardonnay based and Syrah based. So my background is very much from a winemaking perspective, but like Cathy, obviously we've gone through the rigors of the Master of Wine, and a lot of issues came up for me in terms of the way that South African is portrayed within the international climate, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But I think let's just tie it up with the Hemel-en-Aarde, because what Hannes was talking about was the Ridge vineyards, and this is the area of the Hemel-en-Aarde, and this is the Ridge area, which we've got we take from 2 vineyards, both southeast facing, on 2 clones, 777 and 115. So if anybody has a glass, they are 2 wines which are sorry, 1 wine, but they're my GPS range, which is a range of wines which are non-Elgin, and we do 3 of them, and this one is from the Hemel-en-Aarde, which is just from the ridge, so we don't take from anywhere else. And I was compelled to do it because I just felt if Pinot Noir is something we're going to look at from Elgin, and I'll explain, as I say, a little later, it was something that we could take some experiences from Hemel-en-Aarde and hopefully use that, as I hope I will now when I explain a little bit of the differences. But if anybody has the wine, it's I've got a 2018 in my glass. It's actually sorry, I've got my terrible, hang on, let me just take this screen off. But it's a, whoops, it's a more, it's the green label. So it's not a direct, it's not the blue label that I've got obviously behind me here. And these are all, as Hannes alluded to, these are mostly Bockerveld shale soils. And to me, I find the wines a little more fleshy and have a little bit more material sometimes than the Elgin wines. And they tend to be quite attractive on the front palate in terms of aromatic compounds. But at the same time, whether they age as well, I don't know. We're still in a very youthful point. I'd like to feel they both can age just as well. But I just thought I'd just throw that in. That's the one area. So I'm going to hop out of here quickly and head towards, let's head towards this one. So we're going to head out now to what is this bowl of Elgin. It's right here. I'm actually going to come out just to kind of give you an idea of this bowl, because you're going to see this picture in a moment. Not that I've got a very good setup here, but hang on. But you can kind of get an idea of this area, which is bowl shape. And then these vineyards are where we take some of our grapes from. They're again, the 2 clones I'm mostly using is 777 and 115. Again, I'll explain a little bit about those in a moment. This is a very much more direct south-facing slope and a more, and then on the bottom a slightly gentle south-facing. It's not quite as steep. I've got some photos of those later. And then we also take, oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. My humble apologies. Oops. Just giving everybody a giddy sense of so here we've got some further vineyards towards the edge. So I should have mentioned those first. Those ones I just showed you were actually gravel over clay, and I'll explain it also a bit about Elgin and how it works. Whereas these vineyards are mostly table mountain sandstone, and there's 5 vineyards, and we make a little bit from each of them. You'll see just below here where my cursor is, there's my hand is, there's a little, that's actually where we're doing all the fermentation and maturation now from last year. So it's actually quite cool. So yeah, let me just jump straight into the actual presentation. And I'm going to whip through this because I know I talk far too long generally. Now then, where have I got to? Yeah. Here we go. Right. Can everybody see that? Oh, hang on. Something.
Yeah. Now it's showing.
Yeah. Good. I apologize. Yeah. We are, just to let you know. I apologize. I was a little late. We have no electricity here, so I'm on a generator, as per normal. So anyway, the fun. So this was actually the vineyard. This is a little bit of that's actually the vineyard in Hemel-en-Aarde, which we take. I'm not going to play the video, but it gives you a bit of an idea of a little bit of the slope. So effectively, it's got quite a steep facing slope and sort of going up, as I said, from a more southeasterly directional pattern. Sorry, I haven't got the world's best videos, but anyway, there's some grapes there at least. I'm not going to play it all because I've got too much going on. Let's just, I as I said, I came to Elgin from Stellenbosch in 2012, and just to give you an idea of where we are, we're about 70 kilometers from Elgin. From Cape Town. Elgin as a region is not probably the most well known. We don't have a lot of hectares, and one of the the issues that we have is that we are generally we're actually an apple region. So most of our land is planted with about 80% apples and pears, and very little vineyards. In fact, I can tell you from the 8,000 hectares of apples and pears, we're actually about 800 hectares of grapes. In fact, we're actually 90%. That's a poor description, but it does mean that we have some good terroirs for grapes, because even apples like lovely loamy rich soils. So we do have the option to plant really well for grapes. And in terms of the area, it's not an area that has had vines planted for very long. The first vines were planted only in the late 80s by the Paul Klubers and Oak Valleys, and they were only really sent to the cooperative. So really people only started bottling from the 90s, actually under Neil Ellis. And from there, it has grown. But unfortunately, most of those early plantations weren't that successful. So the majority of plantings only took place from the mid-90s and with a further from the early 2000s. Rather sadly, because of the price of apples, and this is our opportunity cost here, we have seen a slight decrease from 800 hectares to about 760 to vineyards. And that's largely because apples have become more profitable as markets have opened up. So that just gives you a little background to what is a fairly small region, despite the 106 hectares, as Cathy alluded to, of Pinot. We are still probably trying to find our feet. And I think, if I'm honest with you, we still have, I think we understand that Chardonnay is possibly our go-to grape variety. It's not the most planted, because I think we still have more Sauvignon, but it is a grape variety that has a good foothold. And I think with Pinot, we're still finding our feet. I'd like to think so. I'm being honest here, because I think that we're still trying to find a stylistic component, and I'll try and put some flesh on that, but it's a lot of it is a little bit of perhaps a little hyperbole and perhaps just subjective thoughts. But in fairness, that I think is still the factor. So yeah, you can just see here a cross section of Elgin. You'll see it rises up to about 500 meters down to about 300. So most of the vineyards are planted at that level, and you can see it's in what is a bowl shape. So if I just put a little outline there, you can see that we are completely surrounded by mountains. So you end up having some effect of that. And importantly, that will play a part in the weather we get just in a moment when we talk about it. So I often talk about a sense of place. And what I mean by that is that, when I alluded earlier to tasting these wines, or tasting Elgin, or rather tasting these African wines when we sat for the Master of Wine exam, and especially when we were overseas with a group of like-minded individuals, South Africa often got sort of put into this category. Well, if it's a Chardonnay or it's a Pinot or it's a Cabernet, it doesn't matter where it's from, as long as South Africa is good enough. And I think largely because we hadn't done ourselves a lot of favors by distinguishing regional differences. We'd rather relied on this sort of slightly oxymoron of having a large amount of really good wines from all sorts. We could literally plant everything everywhere. And yet we also applied the trade that we'd also been planted as the oldest wine region in the New World. So we were saying, well, we've planted from the 1600s. So, so it's like oxymoron in the sense that for me, it's well, if you've planted in the 1600s, you should know pretty much what you should be planting by now. So it's taken far too long to really know. And I think the point being is that I think we do know to an extent. We don't always have the confidence to focus on grapes in the way that some of the other New World countries do. So we tend to sort of offer a smorgasbord of grape varieties. And for me, I think that we need to be more focused. And a sense of place means you've got to find a really top spot to grow a particular grape variety. And I think, we know internationally Chardonnay, Pinot Noir tend to be those two grapes that go hand in hand with being very particularly attuned to different quirks of climate and soil and everything like that. So I'm going to briefly go through the climate because I have a long presentation, which I don't want to go on too long. And I know Cathy will interrupt me after a while to tell me off, but I will. I will just say that to me, a sense of place is climate. Oops, it's not happy. Hang on. Where are we? Soil, topography, clone and rootstock, viticulture, and obviously the way we make the wines. I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate, soil, and clone and rootstock, and a little bit about the fermentation, because I think that's worth bringing in. I'll take out the other ones. And I think that's important because within the Elgin region, climate does play a large part. So what does climate mean? Hannes mentioned latitude. That is critically important. Obviously, altitude, I mentioned that between 300 and 500 meters above sea level. There are some vineyards a little bit lower at about 240. In fact, where we live is about 240 meters above sea level. Obviously, your vineyard site, the wind, which I'll talk about a little bit because that's an incredibly important part of it. And then, of course, you've got some of the more esoteric areas, the humidity levels. These are parts which have a big part to play on the way that the vine is interacting with the moisture within the actual canopy, and actually how that affects irrigation. That obviously there's some more geeky stuff. I'm not going to get too geeky because I get into trouble again, but I will happily go through anything you want to. But light intensity, temperature, soil light quality, and I'm going to talk about the soils as well in a moment. It's worth just bearing in mind that we talk about cool climate in a large sense, and it's not always easy to figure out where we stand in the world's kind of scale. And I've just used this rather old-fashioned, but I suppose prudent, whatever you want to call it, climate degrees. So we divide the world into region 1 to 5. And you can see there that cool to warm is probably more where Elgin lies. It's between 1391 and 1670. We're actually at 1502. So we're actually bang in the middle. And that would be fair to say that's a bang in the middle of a cool region. But we're clearly not a cold region as you would find in Ontario and England and Champagne and so on and so forth. But we're in a sort of cool to what is a warm region. It's important to mention that temperature, we talk about temperature and as Hannes alluded to about the maximum temperatures. I mean, it is very important. In Elgin, you tend to find differences within the region, and I've got a split of 7 different areas, but generally you won't find the temperature going much above 35 in the summer. We usually have between about 6 and 8 hours above 35 in the entire summer, and we have about sort of between 60 and 70 hours over 30 degrees. This is this is interesting. And this year actually we didn't have any over 35. It was a very cold year, but generally that's the case. And in fact, because we also get cold units during the winter, you need about 700 cold units to have proper dormancy, which is very important for Pinot and Chardonnay. And that's important because you get that proper dormancy where the sap is being sucked in and it's not actually able to start budding too early or showing extra leaves. The average here is actually about 1,000 cold units. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why apples are planted, because apples need more cold units than grapes. Grapes are a little bit more easier. And of course, it also affects the lifespan of the vine. I think one fascinating part, and it's possibly a question I have, which I don't have an answer to, is the fact that old Pinot and old Chardonnay are both grapes, and I use them both because I think they are grape varieties that you see having large units of life in places like Burgundy, but we don't see a lot of old vines here. And it may just be that places like Hemel-en-Aarde and Elgin and some of the cooler spots will get into those later stages, because a lot of the the Pinot and Chardonnay planted in places like Stellenbosch and Robertson and stuff are just a little bit too warm. They're not able to go into dormancy properly. So they are being curtailed at 20, 25 years, if not earlier, depending if they pick up, because they're very susceptible to Eutypios or Eutypa. So just to mention, the mean February temperature here is about 19.7. It's pretty low. But a lot of although I put the mean March temperature, majority of our stuff is picked in March, although the Pinot clearly comes in a little earlier, so late February generally. Just a little bit about the rainfall. We're getting about over 1,000 mils roughly. And we do tend to get a reasonable amount in the summer, which is a good and a bad thing, because we do find that means we have slightly higher disease pressure. And rot is certainly a problem in later pick. With Pinot, less of a problem. But if it does hit us, and in some years Pinot can be affected in February, if we do get high rainfall in February, and our average in February is about 35 mils, so it's not small, we do have issues where we'll run into rot. But generally that rainfall helps us, especially if it falls at paraison. We're able to get that succulence in the berries that can start turning and soften up. It also means we have slightly wetter soils, and interestingly, we also have a lot more cover crops, which are permanent. There's a lot more permanency to the cover crops, because of course you're not getting water scavenging from the weeds, because of the fact that there is plenty of water to go around. Just a little picture of us tasting topping up in the rain. What fun is that? Just a little bit about the influence of wind. I mean, I don't want to get too involved, but our majority wind is from the southeaster. It comes on in and generally forms quite a sort of a strong ameliorating wind. It gives you a lot more. It doesn't necessarily cool us down a lot, but it cools us down a while. But within the Elgin framework, what we find is because of the mountains around us, we tend to get a lot more of this effect of a lot more cloud cover. And I've got a good picture of that in a moment when we talk about that. Our main winter rain is coming from the north. Whoops, sorry. Coming from the northwest. Right now in winter, we're getting our northwesters. And then in the warmer days, which we do get, obviously, when it does start hitting 30, 35, we're getting these cooling sea breezes. Those are really critical because they start hitting you at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So, for those living here, there's always that slightly kind of chill factor, even in the middle of summer. That's the picture I wanted to say. So you can see in the background, that's the edge of the mountains, and it's actually blue sky. So when you're driving through Elgin, or when you're living here, you tend to find you get this cloud cover, which is a part of the southeaster. But once you move over the mountain, you can go quite easily from about 15, 16 degrees over to about 28 degrees. And that's in the space of probably 3 or 4 kilometers. It's not a long way to go. And that has a profound effect, because what you get is with cloud cover, you're getting an increasingly absorption of ultraviolet B radiation. Now, that's a good thing in a northern climate, for example, in Burgundy, because you want to have the sun to ripen your grapes. And it actually is part of the grape ripening cycle. It pushes sugars to your grapevines. This is important because this absinthic acid, as I mentioned, tends to push that sugar to your vines when it's sunny. But by having a cloud cover, it actually restricts it. So what you find is you just have a slightly more restricted fruit ripening, and in terms of sugar ripening, but your phenolic ripening will carry on unabated. So this is pretty useful. This southeaster also gets quite windy, and when it does start blowing, you will actually get quite a lot of rain and precipitation, what they call a black southeaster.
Richard, can I just interject for a second? Joop Jensen is asking about how do you define cold units? If you can just tell us.
That is the mystery that I've been looking for the last 10 years. They are defined in 2 ways. There's the Infratech way and the Richardson way. So a unit is the amount of hours that it is below 9 degrees at night. 9 degrees. So Infratech use a system where if it's below 9 degrees, i.e. nothing can grow, you have essentially a cold unit. So the amount of hours, in the same way that you get hours over 28 degrees. So if you look at it, 9 degrees and lower will produce that cold unit, and they're all added up in a sort of a monthly sum. They only are valid from really from sort of I suppose late April. As it goes in dormancy right through until about September time, depending obviously when it buds. Once it buds, the relevance of coal units is there's no relevance. Sorry, that's how the Infratech works, and then the Richardson works on the principle that if it goes over 28, you take away an hour. Actually, I must correct myself. Maybe Hannes might know. I think it's over 28, but you actually take away hours. So if you, for example, with the Infratech, it remains a constant below 9 degrees in the sense that it adds up and it doesn't take away. Whereas the other way, you do take hours away if it gets warm. And obviously that makes sense because you can, if you're going to have lots of cold units and then suddenly getting a hot spell, that hot spell may bring about the chance for budding if it's later in the season in, say, August, September time. So that has an impact on it. So the cold units after that tend to be less relevant. So that's just a way of looking at it.
Joop, I think he was asking about if it's measured by hours or days.
Hours.
I think
Yes,
it's
hours.
Yes.
Hours. It's measured by hours. Yeah. It's hours below 9 degrees or 10 degrees. I think I can't remember. It depends
on whose criteria you're using, but some guys working on 7 degrees. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've certainly had quite a lot so far. Last week it was 2 or 3 degrees every morning. So
for sure.
this week is a little warmer. So yeah, just one of the other points that I've got. Humidity is an important part to play because when I moved here, I was intrigued because in Stellenbosch you've got about 40% humidity, 45%. Here we're more like 60-65. Although when I've been looking at all the Hortec research, climate change has definitely had an impact on on increasing that humidity. We're more like 75, in many cases 80. And I've certainly noticed that over the years, where that humidity is a problem in the sense that you will increase the levels of rot. So in the wine zone, you have to be a little bit careful that although it's a good thing because it's creating moisture, and there's actually a more modern term for humidity called vapor pressure deficit. For those geeks, you must look it up. But it measures basically the vapor around your bunch zone. This is really critical because if you start doing the graphs, you actually see Elgin shouldn't need any irrigated supplementary irrigation. But if you do the same graphs in Burgundy, you can see that they would or should have supplementary irrigation. So there's some quite interesting stats going on here. I think the problem here is we do have a history of apple growing where they do need irrigation. So you find that there's very few dryland vines, and it's something that I think I would like to look at planting when I start at some point. So yeah, that's the humidity. And again, the evaporation is then affected because obviously higher humidity means you're getting less evaporation rates and transpiration. I'm getting a little bit evolved here, but one of the last points here is that the dew points we find are much higher, much earlier reached in the summer. So we don't have that dryness. So you often find we get very damp grapes right through the early morning. In fact, a lot of my sampling has to take place after about 10 o'clock because it's still actually quite wet in the vineyards, and it takes a while. And of course, that has another factor of increasing the chance for sort of mildews or anything like that. It is also useful to note that it also affects the row orientation. I've noticed that, you wouldn't want to plant here east-west, because your south side is going to be affected far more by having excess moisture and therefore rot, rather than the north side, which is getting the sun. So just a few other points, because it's obviously a late region, like Hannes also mentioned, because you're picking a lot later, you tend to find that you obviously are picking at a cooler time, because you're not picking right in the heat of the summer in sort of end of January, early February. And I think that's really useful, and therefore your solar radiation levels are different. They're later. You're also, picking in that autumnal feature. It's also relevant to note that obviously the temperature at night is a little bit cooler too. So you're not having to necessarily, I've yet to pick any grapes much above 15 degrees centigrade, whatever time of the year we pick them, because they are generally fairly cool, whereas I remember clearly in the morning, if the temperature's been sort of 30, 35, 36 or 40 degrees in Stellenbosch overnight, it's actually never cooled down much more than about 30 degrees. So yeah, let me quickly go on. How are we getting on? So just a little bit about soils. Just to remember this cross section, that angle I gave you before. So if we now interplant the soils on top of that, you basically have traditionally the Table Mountain sandstone on the excess. And just to kind of give you also a secondary idea, but if you look at this graph, the right-hand side, or rather the right-hand side, which is more the pink color, is not areas where we're planting grapevines. Most of the grapevines are planted from sort of like a quarter into the left and then off to the far left. And those left areas mostly are Table Mountain sandstones, the more the oranges, and predominantly Bockerfeld shales outside of that. You do have right in the very middle, the very dark blue is actually a loamy soil, which is interesting because loam is something that generally has been eroded in the Western Cape away because of water courses over the period. It's quite a fertile soil. Not a lot of vineyards are planted on the loam soil, but it is very nice for apples because it can grow vast quantities of them. But we don't have also the water courses to get rid of the loam. So in a way, it sits there in a happy sort of medium. And then around side that, you've got quite a lot of sort of gravels and what we call takulas, which are these mixtures of gravels and clay and a little bit of sand as well. So those are just kind of ideas. I always put this in because I know we've got a lot of geeky people watching, so I apologize. But obviously, whatever the soils are, we don't get the actual character from the soils. It's just basically the fact that they're, flinty or whatever. It's just a medium. And I harbor on this because to me, soil is actually much more important than this. It's, I talk about when I look at it is, and I know the French and the like tend to talk extensively about just how important the soil is. To me, it's all about what the depth of the soil is, how it holds water, whether it can or cannot, its drainage clearly, whether you've augmented that with further drainage channels, the way that it can hold nutrients or it can't, and actually the color of the soil, the way that it can reflect heat or light off the soil. So it's something that, you know, we get a little bit overboard. We like to find terroir in the soil, and I'm a proponent that I find climate is 50% of the matrix and soil is more like 25%. I don't find it as important, but those critical parts are. I wrote here that, you know, most people actually agree it's the moisture in the soil that's possibly the most important. And for those Burgundian fans, limestone and people like Claude Bourguignon would harp on about the fact that limestone is the super soil, and that's largely because it can hold water or it can release water. That's great, which is important in a place like Burgundy, but less important outside of that area. So just to give you two soils, you can see on the right there's a Croix-Treff soil, which is one we have a lot of. We don't actually have a lot of Pinot on it, but we do a bit of Syrah and a bit of Chardonnay, and it's a much deeper soil. It works much better for us, whereas the left-hand side is a lot more shallow, and those are on the more peripheral areas that I mentioned on the previous slide, and they're not great. So Mispah is a little bit shallow. You can see just how shallow it is from that graph. Keeping to go. So I mentioned the decomposed shells that give that lovely structure and concentration. The sandstone is that lovely delicacy and lifted fruit flavors, and also lighter in body. So they tend to be a little different. And then you've got something in between that with the Tequila and Glen Rosa. So I'm not going to get too into detail because I'm already moving on. So I mentioned. Oh, yes, I was also asked a little bit about clones. So, oh, yeah, we're just right in the middle there. I just thought I'd put that slide in. I know this is a funny slide. I love this slide. But I just thought we talk about clones, but I think, you know, when I'm talking to perhaps, you know, Hannes and the other and all the other winemakers, we know exactly what we're talking about. But I think there's often when I do my presentations in overseas audiences, there's a great many people worried that we're doing some sort of genetic manipulation. So I just want to say that it's all about choosing particular grape varieties that have certain clonal influences. They've often been bred for quality, but in the past for quantity, because clearly that was the whole idea. But most of the more modern clones are bred with an eye to making better wines. And they come from mother vines, and you take a cutting, you try and work out, you know, how it works. Obviously, it's going to have certain rootstocks that will be more compatible. And this is how it works over a period of time and years. You'll find a lot of the clones for Pinot are mostly from Burgundy and grown in South Africa. Not a lot are made locally. So I'm just going to run through them, and I think Hannes has already mentioned them. So I've got a lot of slides, so I apologize. Just the clone 777. Hannes mentioned it earlier. There's a few important factors here, because one of the issues or one of the interesting factors is that when I've looked at this in the past, this is a clone that has, you know, exactly what this says. It's this juicy black fruit. It's sort of compact clusters. It's got quite intense thick skins, tends to have a density to it. And as I say, can be a big, powerful monster if you're not careful. What is fascinating, though, is this is often done in an area, for example, not necessarily in South Africa, or it's been done perhaps in a warmer climate. We actually find quite a difference here. And I'm going to highlight this point because the next clone, the 115, to me is often the opposite. We seem to have this interchangeable character. But here in Elgin, when we're on a sandstone soil, which is what I mentioned right at the beginning, there was those 5 vineyards. They're all on sandstone. We get a lot lighter red fruits, quite a juicy textured wine, but very fine and delicate, very elegant styles of wine, and much more in the red fruit basis. And they have a sort of more blade-like tannin structure. They don't tend to be that high in sugars, and certainly a lot of the Pinots are towards that 13.5%, or this year actually more towards 13, but that generally is. And then if you go on to a more gravel, the other vineyard I showed was grab over clay. So I'm just, actually, you know, I've even got a picture of it. Here we go. Fantastic. So that's me standing in a vineyard, looking down onto this quite steep slope. So the bottom picture gives a bit more idea to the steepness of the slope. So that one is on gravel over clay. And here the 777 tends to give a little bit of a mix more of red and black fruits, a bit more juicy and fleshy. And it's a slightly more perfumed wine. And that more granularity to the tannins. So sort of, I get this mineral, we're not allowed to call it mineral anymore, but this sort of, I call pumice stone, or whatever you want to call it, granitic feel. And also accentuated by quite a big acidity. So that's something to bear in mind. on these soils. And then we move to the 115, which is in the books, in the textbooks, we'll find it a more often red fruits. It tends to have aromatics, it tends to have raspberries, it has all the sort of lovely things. But I'm going to be a whole thing here. But for us, we don't get that at all. On a sandstone, we get actually more quite high anthocyanins, quite a deep color. It retains that liftedness because obviously sandstone tends to give you that aromatic purity. It still does have the red fruits, but it has a lot more black fruits coming in here. Much more denser and fuller than the 777. Much more richness in the texture, and that sweetness to the tannins to me on sandstone over something like gravel. So this is a different. It works very much better with newer oak, and those two vineyards which we have a little bit more new wood here than the 777, which have a little bit less, more second fill wood. On the gravel over clay, which is a vineyard. Oh, here we go. Here, I've got the picture of this. So it's actually the same thing, but the vineyard is in the middle ground. So it's a slightly different aspect on a slightly gentler slope. And that's the one I'm going to talk about. So this is the 115. So here it has a little bit more to it. This is a much bigger wine, much more black fruits. And here pushing the whole thing up much more minerally and that grippy, chewy tannins and good density. So a slightly more different style of wine, but quite fleshy. And that's something, yeah. Also important, it works well with hot years because the clay underneath tends to ameliorate the heat and cool the vine down. So there's our thing. We also use a bit of 667. I'm not going to go through this because I can see it's already at 9 o'clock. But we do use a little bit of 667 and actually 113. Hannes did mention that earlier. And it's a great clone, I think. It's a slightly more feminine, arguably, clone, but it's one we tend to use. So just the vinification very, very quickly. So we just use handpicking. We sort on conveyors. We do. Okay, we even have videos of it. So so we have the whole thing. But basically, we do usually have more sorters. We were doing a bit of video editing to try and get this right. But yeah, we do it all hand sorted. We actually bought that fancy rotovib, so it can do it almost does a bit of sorting itself. That's part of the whole appeal. And we also, Hannes talked about stem inclusion, and we do about 20% in those years which are suited. Again, as Hannes mentioned, there's no necessity to do it every year, and it will depend as they come in as to how much we'll do. I haven't been bold enough to do any more than that, and I'm not sure it's necessary possibly in the Elgin framework. What perhaps is, and then we put them into these little gravy boats. You'll see here that we can lift them up without having to damage the, without them going through a very vicious sort of must hopper or whatever you want to call it. So it's a chance to put them in these open top fermenters and allow them to macerate. So they sit here for about 3 or 4 days because all of the ferments are natural and we don't use any enzymes. So they need to get a bit of color and anthocyanin. So they have that chance to do that over the period of time. And what is worth mentioning also is in terms of the way we make them, we tend to use this delistage technique, where we rack from the bottom all the juice out during the punch down or pump over, but instead of pumping it over, we actually rack it to a separate tank, and that separate tank we actually use that gravy boat you saw by putting it in from the bottom, and we can actually fill those up and pump them to another tank, leave them for about 5 hours. We let them settle, and that's important because those settling will just take out some of those vegetal components, a few seeds or stems that are maybe still caught in there. And that allows us to sort of almost clean the wine up as the wine is being fermented, rather than having to then rack them towards the end of malolactic when they're a little more susceptible to volatile acidity. I just thought I'd put this slide in, but just as we do have to do punch downs when we have little baby amounts, when we do 500, and sometimes it's make it a family affair. So so my 2 daughters and Mariette are in charge. I'm in charge of the photos. So they do a bit of punch downs as well. So
right.
And then just
Richard. Oh,
yep.
Okay. I think people might want you to talk about your maturation, but then I'm sorry,
Yep.
I have to stop you. I've got
Yep.
a few questions for you
Yeah, go for it.
afterwards. Okay. Do you
No
want to
problem.
talk quickly about your eggs and your ceramic eggs, and then I'd like to ask
I'll
you
just
some
finish off.
questions.
Okay, I'll just finish off. So we're using these different eggs. We've got, you can see the barrels obviously was majority what we use. We also use these breathable plastic eggs, and we use below the ceramic eggs as well as a maturation vessel. So that's all I've really got to say, because I had the wines afterwards, and obviously you can.
Thank heaven. Yes, the words that I love to hear, the wines. Richard, that was a really lovely introduction to the soils, etc., etc. But now, could you please contrast for me your ridge wine with your Elgin wine?
Sure. Okay. Well,
talk us through how you experience it.
Okay. All right. So let's start with the second one, because we can then move on. So for me, what I find with the ridge wine is we get a lovely fleshiness to it. We get good acidity. Hannes mentioned it, the fact that it is a relative altitude, good fleshiness to it. I get a much more broader structure. Color wise, obviously it depends, because those are shells. The soils are different, but we get a lovely succulence to the texture here, whereas we don't always get that, in the Elgin fruit. And as I say, we get a bit of a mixture, because it's both the clones. But for me, I find these wines always have a bit more appeal and fleshiness and fragrance. They have a bit more to coat the bones of the tannins. That would be my main point to say with the GPS. With the clonal selection, I think the challenge that Elgin has had over the years is that Pinot has often been a bit bony and sometimes stringy, tends to lack the flesh, and it does have a savory note to it. I've often said, they have a certain sort of Nuit Saint-Georges, but on a lighter scale. So kind of, they just don't have this sort of the mid palate weight. And I think that's something is still a challenge. So it's worth looking at trying to really ripen them fully. If you look at the proponents of Pinot Noir here, there's been a tendency to look at whether we pick them a little earlier or a little later. And I'm of the opinion that we need to pick them when they're ripe, and that may be a little bit later. Perhaps because we don't need to worry about the fact that they're going to lose lots of acidity, because they tend to retain it better. But I think if they're not picked ripe, you do find this rather lacking wine. They can be very pretty wines, very, very light, but very, very delicate and ethereal, which I think is not something that people are necessarily after in the modern style of Pinot. Although that could be something people may turn to in the future. But I do think that you need to get that structure. And importantly, I think with Pinot, we have to remember that they're not frivolous little wines that, even in Burgundy, they're quite deep colored wines. These are wines you want to age. And importantly, you also want to get secondary characters. For me, sometimes the early pick stuff can be all about sort of red cherries and strawberries and lack any real other substance, which means that they need some sort of work done to them. So, leaving them on the skins a little bit longer. I know when I first started, I sort of kept to that 12-day sort of max 10 to 12 days. And nowadays I'm actually doing a lot longer, up to about 2 or 3 weeks. This year we did about 25 days. And I think we get a lot more structure to it that way, which is important. And we mustn't be frightened of having a lot of tannin. I don't see that as a problem. I think we looked to the New World for too long, especially in places like Marlborough or Chile, where all these tannins are sort of super soft. But I don't think there's a problem. I mean, these are supposed to be wines that are going to age. And like our sort of Syrahs and Chardonnays, we need to be a bit aware that Pinot is a wine to age, and they're not all just for frivolous fun. So I think that Elgin can do that pretty well. And I think that, working with new oak is also sort of critical with not too much, very much sort of honing it down to enough and not using coopers that are too flamboyant. Perhaps a little bit of larger oak foudre, 500 liters is worth doing. That would be my main sort of critique. Okay,
Richard, before I forget, a lot of people are asking if they can see your slides. Are you prepared to share them?
Sure.
Okay. Moshe, can you tell us how will be a little bit later, how will be the easiest for that to happen? Richard, we have 2 questions, one specifically for you. Can you repeat what you were saying about the UV radiation? Phenolic ripeness continues, but physiological ripeness does not. That's the question.
Okay, so when a grape is ripening, if you can imagine, the grape's sole purpose in life is not to be interfered by humans at all. It's to be basically ripe so that the birds can pick it and then it can be planted somewhere else. And the essence of it is that if you have a grape variety, if you have bright sunshine, you're getting high levels of UVB, particularly UVA between 10 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is, as we know, is when we all get burnt if we go out. But that's important because what it does is it actually triggers something called absinthic acid. I'm not pronouncing it right, but it triggers something in the vine called absinthic, which then promotes sugar growth. So it's almost, the vine realizes it's a hot sunny day. We're going to get a lot of UV light. We need to push sugars to the grapevine, the grape bunches and berries. And importantly, the reason for that is then they'll make them nice and sweet for the birds to pick, and therefore off they go and then plant them and whatever, that they'll have some new vines, because it's a survival thing. Now, that's a great thing because we need to get grape sugar ripeness, but we're all very familiar with the problem that with climate change and various other factors, we get too much grape sugar ripeness and we end up then with correspondingly high alcohols of 15%. So cloud cover actually slows that process down because there's no actual natural UV light. So the grapes are not, or the sugars are not pushed towards the grapevines, the grape berries, not pushed to the grape berries, rather it's slowed down. However, the tannin ripeness will continue. Obviously, it's still quite warm, even under that cloud cover, or warm enough. And phenolic ripeness, which is that sort of slowing down of, ripening of tannins in the grape sugars, in the grape berries, will carry on. That's not necessarily affected by your sunlight. So what you're having is the ability to pick when it's phenolically ripe without having to then pick it when it's got a very, very high sugar. This is a very good thing, but actually in years like this one, it actually was a challenge. This year we had phenolic ripeness about 2 weeks earlier than grape ripeness. So what you can end up with is having the problem where you don't have enough sugar. So you end up having to pick it at a very low alcohol. Or you wait and you end up with very little anthocyanins because the tannins start to get sort of this, not slip skin, but a sort of, we just don't get the color out of the grape bunch.
Okay, super, thank you. And Cassidy also says thanks you. He understands very well now. Okay. Hannes, I'm going to pick on you next. We've had a question here that is, how would you compare the taste, the aromas, the structure of one of your wines? Let's just say the Ignis to those from Burgundy.
I always try to strive to make wines that I love Burgundy, and it's something that's close to my heart, but we don't try to emulate them. But it happens that some of the wines you can at least put in the mold of some of the regions in Burgundy. And I would say the Ignis, for instance, is for me a wine that gravitates more towards the Chambol region, maybe more elegant, that fist in a silk glove scenario. You don't have that structure of Gevrey, for instance, which I would say Friede is closer to. But I would say if one can do that comparison, I would say Ignis closer to the Chambol area in Burgundy. Yeah, that's how I usually try to explain it to myself.
Okay, I'd like to ask you if the viewers out there sound like a television host. The viewers out there, please would you ask your questions now? I also see that Barine, you've got a brand, Tesla's Doll. How have you experienced taking a Pinot Noir to the market, a South African Pinot Noir to the market, and which markets do you find most receptive to your wines?
I will have to unmute.
She's on, and she should let us see your face, please.
Yeah.
I put where now? Sorry.
You weren't cooking supper, were you?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, excuse my cap.
It's cold.
I was getting a bit cold. Thank you. Yes, Tesla's Doll Wines is a business that was started in 2015. I've also worked with Hannes, that's here tonight, and I produce a Pinot Noir and a Chardonnay. The Pinot Noir, now the 6th vintage, has done very good. The grapes is sourced from the Hemel-en-Aarde ridge, and as Hannes said, the Hemel-en-Aarde ridge delivers Pinot Noir that is between the upper Hemel-en-Aarde Valley and Hemel-en-Aarde Valley. So open fruit profile and just beautiful red fruit notes.
Are you drinking it tonight?
I had Chardonnay earlier. Actually, the last bit. So yeah, what I can savor, I savor. Tesla's Dal is a real spoil for me. It's a very limited production. I'm actually very proud of the feedback that I received on the wine so far. It's done very well in the UK. USA currently exported to about 10 markets in small pockets, and currently sold in South Africa at wine boutiques and high-end restaurants nationally, also in very small quantities. So I also bought a piece of property in Tesla's Dal, which is about 23 kilometers northeast from the Hemel-en-Aarde. So the temperature is a bit warmer. It gets up to 32, 34 degrees in the summer. And the soil is also 50%, between 35 and 55% clay rich and iron rich. So perfect for Pinot. There's a little bit of sodium on the piece that I bought. So yeah, if I sort out my water this year, I can start planting. And then basically in about 7 or 8 years, I'll produce a Pinot from Tesla's Dal, which is my hometown also.
Well, congratulations. That's very exciting. Richard can send you his water. He apparently has enough around his bunches.
Oh, he does. Yes, please.
We've had a question here about pests and diseases. What kind of baboons, are they a problem? What other kinds of pests and diseases do you have in your vineyards? Hannes?
We have quite a lot of baboons that we need to that's now more the animalia and so forth, but no, I kind of like to farm with them, and I'm quite green, and but birds and baboons are quite a big problem, but we keep them at bay, and we keep them we draw an imaginary line in the mountain to keep them there. And I think in the Hemel-en-Aarde, the main thing, because we don't have so much aeration compared to the upper Hemel-en-Aarde and the Hemel-en-Aarde ridge, is fungal pressure. We have a lot of that because the Hemel-en-Aarde is a bit concave, especially the little corner where Freda Vineyard is situated, and we sometimes get the southeasterly wind just pushing back clouds and then hanging there with high humidity, and so we always have to be on our toes with just the leaf practices and so forth to make sure that we have good aeration in the vineyards. But definitely fungal diseases can be quite a problem. But if you do your part in the vineyard, that we try and do, we spend a lot of time in the vineyard to just make sure that we have good aeration, and that is the main problem. But baboons, birds, and then obviously the fungal situation.
Richard, what do you have in Elgin?
What do we have? Well, I'm going to share my screen again, but we have, in terms of pests, we have a big problem with baboons. And just to give you an idea of this, so this vineyard here shares itself with Shannon, which I'm sure a lot of guys, viewers, listeners, whatever, will know. And we have two sets of baboons here and here, and they come on in. This is a hydroelectric plant, so we call them the Eskom baboons, and they don't go on load shedding. And we have another one which is coming in from the dam up here. They rip away a huge amount of grapes every year. This year, I lost Pinot and 1.5 tons of Chardonnay to them, so it's a huge problem. In terms of disease pressure, we have obviously that problem with rot. So mildew is a particular issue with not just downy but also powdery mildew. And in Pinot Noir, it's less of an issue because obviously Pinot comes in a little earlier, but in some years it can be a problem. It's much more an issue with the later grapes like Syrah. With other pressure like rot, similarly, because it's more susceptible to rot because of its skins, but it's not something we see so much of in the vineyard, except for, as I say, when we are getting slightly higher humidities, where that could become much more of a problem in the future.
Yeah, somebody's mentioned lion dung. Lion dung is a good way to keep baboons away. I also read that somewhere. And the big problem, of course, with baboons is not only that they eat your grapes, but they're very destructive.
That's the problem. Yeah.
They break,
They're very-
they break the
So-
vines.
What actually, you just reminded me. Sorry, that actually on that road you could see that ran between the where the
Yes.
baboons are and the vineyards. The owner of Shannon, James Downs, he actually puts out apple crates of apples that are picked up from the ground that aren't get used, and they position them over, and they rather eat those if they possibly can, and then just don't avoid the vineyards. But it is a big problem.
That's actually a solution I suggested to Jean Daniel in Napier. He was having a huge problem with baboons, and it must have been about 10 years ago. I said, why don't you just feed them? give them an alternative food source and give them a reason to stay out of the vineyards. Okay, I'm pleased to hear that. Moshe, do you have any more questions you think your students would like to hear?
Well,
fellow students.
all the, in fact, I've compiled, as you've seen earlier today, what I thought was really good questions, 4 or 5 questions, but they were all answered. I was asking about comparing another new world, in inverted commas, region or different Pinot Noirs, and Hannes touched on the Californian comparison. I just think it's because not many people tried Pinot Noirs from Elgin or Hemel-en-Aarde. Outside, we have obviously in the audience people from Turkey and from Brazil, and I doubt if in the near future they'll get a chance to try your wines. But I think it gives them some kind of indication of what stylistically they can expect from the two regions. So I don't know if Richard want to touch on that, but my question on clones was, we dealt with clones.
You don't deal with clones.
Even STEM inclusion, Richard touched, because a friend of mine contributed a question about STEM inclusion, and the last point I want to make before Richard maybe answer about the other regions that are similar stylistically is the fact that it's we're talking 250 hectares in total between the two regions for Pinot Noir. I think your slide was showing, and I think the question is it's really minuscule. It's I think about 2/3 of the size of Nuit Saint-Georges, just to give it just some kind of indication for so it's almost like we teasing the world with the fact that there's great Pinot Noir and Chardonnays as well from Elgin and Hemel-en-Aarde, but is it likely to change? Do you think there'll be more plantings? I mean, Beren was talking about the project, but is it likely to go to in the next 10 years to, let's say, 1,000 hectares?
According to the data that I was looking at today, literally in 2012, it was 1.1% of total plantings. And now, nearly 10 years later, we've managed to steam ahead to 1.2% of total plantings. So, I mean, I don't know.
I think
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Hannes?
I can. So I think. Oh, sorry, Hannes. Yeah.
I think it looks like what we see is quite a lot of plantings, but it's still a very small percentage if you look at the bigger picture. In our valley, there are a lot of new plantings, but it's 2 hectares here and 3 hectares there. But if you compare that to the total plantings from a holistic point of view, it's very minute. And I think Pinot Noir can only absorb that much, So it's also interesting. But I think now that more interesting areas are being discovered, even if it's 1 hectare or 0.5 hectares. I think that's what it's about. And I think there is where we're going to see the fantastic new great things happening, not necessarily the big plantings.
Shall I keep answering that question? Because what was that? I can't remember the other question. But anyway, with regards to plantings, I think one has to put it in perspective that the challenge here is the fact that farmers just don't simply make a profit, and they're not going to plant grapes if they can't make a profit in the future. what's interesting, the litmus paper test is in a place, well, number of places, but Elgin is quite an interesting one because it's not even a wine region. As I mentioned earlier, it's an apple region. So clearly a farmer has to have the incentive to plant grapevines. And currently, when I started there, the profitability of apples was 8.7 times higher. It's gone down over the years to be about 3.4 to 5 times higher, but it's still a lot higher. So planting a hectare of apples, even if the land is not the most fertile and probably would be better for grapes, still makes sense. So ultimately, the price of grapes has to go up, and the grapes that need to be planted, which have value add, needs to be planted. Now, why I say that is because we are seeing, obviously, grapes that don't work, or rather grapes that have low value. Sadly, our number one grape variety, Chenin Blanc, is a fabulous grape variety, but it doesn't attract a lot of value when it comes to selling it. So ultimately, you're going to plant grapes which are going to attract higher tonnage price per ton. We've actually seen in Elgin an interesting scenario where Sauvignon Blanc, which is a pretty good high crop grape variety, is being actually planted, uprooted and planted, and replanted with something like Pinot or Chardonnay, and that could happen in the future. But we still have to increase the price. The price has to go up so much more for the farmer to really put an investment into actually planting grapevines. And I think that even though there's not necessarily opportunity costs in other areas, like Stellenbosch or Robertson or something, or Robertson does have it. Citrus fruits are very profitable. That it's going to take an awful long time for that to really show itself, and it may mean we end up going down to 70,000 hectares or 60,000, but then we'll come back hopefully later with the right grapes at the right prices.
And in new areas that are better suited to those different varieties.
Well, a great example, the Koop-Bokkerveld is an interesting area, which is cold. It has reasonable rain. It's a lot of potential here, but nobody's interested in taking their apples out. I mean, it just isn't something that people are that bothered about. So they're not going to do it until they have a very, very good reason to.
The other question, Richard, was about the stylistic. I know it's potentially a massive question.
Good question. Right. No. I think so. Stylistically, I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you've got different soils. I mean, clearly, when I look at South Africa, I would say I look towards places like Australia. And when I'm in Australia, let's say I mentioned that Elgin has 1,502 degree days. Mornington Peninsula has 1,495, so that's pretty close. But again, it depends on what part of the peninsula you are. If you're going up to the Upper Yarra, you're going to have a little bit more, but probably stylistically is similar than the Mornington. But there again, that acidity and tannin profile does tend to exhibit in the Mornington Peninsula. So those would be my areas. Obviously, it's difficult in New Zealand because obviously Marlborough's on volcanic soils. We don't have those soils, so they are completely different. And Central Otago has a particular stylistic difference with their sweeter tannins, even though they are actually much colder than technically we are. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one. And as Hannah said, I mean, where his brother is in Santa Maria, I had a chance to see him actually about 2 years ago, taste his wines there when we were on the Master Wine Trip. But obviously their soils are fantastic. They're all they're all made up of this sort of, what is it called? I've completely forgotten now.
It's ocean.
Yeah, it's a stuff we like. It's bentonite, basically.
Sediment. Yeah.
It's a sedimentation. So they're using a lot more stems in their soils. In their wines, and that's a useful impact because it's giving a bit more structure to the diatoms. Diatoms was what I was looking for in the earth. So they are different. I mean, perhaps the Central Coast. We were doing one of these interviews I was with Jasmine Hirsch the other day, and I know we visited her. Dimitri will know well. We visited him in ridiculously large cars, but the thing was, I would say those are another area where the sort of Pinots are possibly a little more similar. But we don't get like the Russian River Cola tonics and cherry colas that we tend to get here. We don't get that here at all. So that would be my area. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you, I don't know, Moshe, it's 9:30. I think we have to bid goodbye to everybody unless they've got they're now finding out that Joop lives in just down the corner from Claire, someone in the Netherlands. I don't know.
Yes,
but
people mentioning.
Just two questions. One question for Hannes and for Richard before we can say goodbye. You want to say goodbye and do some more housekeeping? So Hannes, I gave you a gazillion rands because that's what you need to buy a vineyard overseas these days with our dreadful exchange rate. If somebody convinced you to leave the beautiful Hemel-en-Aarde, where would you want to plant a vineyard?
Oh, sure. Plant or buy?
Both.
I probably would gravitate towards Burgundy. Yeah, the problem is I saw what the prices are the other day.
He said only gazillion.
It's only a gazillion. Sorry, maybe you need a gazillion.
Yeah. No, I think there are so many interesting places, and I think there are maybe uncharted places that's not planted yet. But I would probably get to a cooler site. If there's one place in South Africa I really believe in is the Outeniqua ward. I think it's quite interesting.
Oh, yes.
I think we have a immense difference in temperatures, and I've been involved in a project there 15 or 20 years ago, and I must say, as an area, I think in years to come we will see some great things. Yeah, so yeah, but I probably would gravitate towards more south or more north.
And Richard, you can use some of your pounds plus the gazillion rands I'm going to give you. Where are you going to plant a vineyard or buy some land?
Goodness. Well, I would certainly be keen, clearly, also to explore some of the areas here as well. You know, you talk about the Outeniqua and Uniondale, and that area is definitely a possibility. But if I was to go overseas, then I think, you know, I wouldn't possibly. I don't take enough cocaine to really fit into the Burgundian set, but.
Oh.
But perhaps I would. Perhaps you know the flight towards Jura, where there's some interesting Chardonnay being made in a non-oxidative style now. That might be quite fun. Or perhaps Germany. I mean, there's some. You know, they're trying very hard with some great you know, Pinots, and I think that with climate change, there could be some potential somewhere around, you know, the middle of Germany or even the Moselle. I mean, I don't know. It's a tricky one. I've actually no real idea, and I'm really grasping at straws here. So
you can, according to Claire, you can go and plant. You can go and make great cool climate Pinot just around the corner from Joop's house in Gielen in the Netherlands.
Perfect. Absolutely. Well, that sounds fantastic.
Okay, Moshe, do you have any idea of how we're going to share the slides with these happy people, and then we're going to say goodbye to them?
I think if Richard send them to me, if you don't mind, the slides or the presentations, and I'd encourage people to get in touch via my website. Richard, are you okay with me
sure.
directing the traffic that way? So anybody interested in the slides, Richard or Hannes shared today, the email is moshe@inthevineyardwith. Don't forget the with after in the vineyard, because people sometimes just say in the vineyard. It's inthevineyardwith.com. Moshe, MOSHE @inthevineyardwith.com. Send me an email and I'll happily forward it to you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Hannes. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
great.
Kathy.
Great.
It's been
Thanks,
fantastic.
Cathy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Richard.
Now your mission,
Thank
you, Moshe.
the mission is to go and find Hemel-en-Aarde or Elgin Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, even in Brazil.
Hannes, I was having some of yours too.
Oh, fantastic, man. What vintage do you have there? The 90?
I've got the 16.
Okay, fantastic.
The Ridge, and also
Lovely, man.
But an old vintage I found of the Frida.
Oh, fantastic. Lucky, man.
Yeah.
13. Great
stuff.
Come and visit. Thanks for tonight. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.